Before we begin, I want you to do something simple, something that has become essential to how we examine accounts like this one. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time on your clock at the moment these words reach you. We track these details because, over years of reviewing sealed reports, restricted correspondence, and case files never intended for public circulation, a pattern has emerged that remains difficult to explain. Certain stories do not surface randomly. They reappear at particular hours, in particular places, on particular screens, as if timing itself plays a role in their return. Fix your place, fix your time, and now we'll fix another. On paper, this was an unremarkable field assignment, a routine survey conducted in a stretch of the central Appalachian Mountains, already cataloged, already mapped, and already believed to be understood. The region had been studied for decades by geologists, hydrologists, and biologists drawn to its complex limestone formations and extensive cave networks. Nothing in the initial paperwork suggested controversy. No red flags. No warnings. The authorization forms were stamped, signed, and filed without objection. The site appeared in multiple public records as stable, inactive, and geologically unremarkable by comparison to other cave systems in the region. Yet the archive tells a different story. The first folder associated with this case contains no photographs, only correspondence. Typed memos exchanged between regional offices, written in the cautious, understated language common to institutional communication. Phrases recur across multiple pages: routine assessment, baseline measurements, environmental variance. Nothing that suggests urgency, nothing that hints at what would later be sealed. The Appalachian Range, where this survey took place, is older than most mountain systems on Earth. Its slopes are rounded, worn down by time, rather than sharpened by tectonic violence. Dense hardwood forests blanket the ridges, broken only by narrow hollows and sudden limestone outcroppings where the land collapses inward on itself. Sound behaves strangely in these areas. Locals have long remarked that voices carry in unpredictable ways, while other noises seem to vanish entirely. Wind moves through the trees without warning, then stops just as abruptly, leaving behind a silence that feels deliberate rather than natural. The cave entrance lay several miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by foot along a disused logging trail last cleared decades earlier. According to survey notes, the opening was partially obscured by brush and rockfall, consistent with natural erosion patterns common to the region. It had been documented before, marked on regional cave maps as a shallow system with no known chambers of interest. Previous explorers had logged it as narrow, damp, and unremarkable. The individual assigned to the survey had built a career on precisely this type of work: methodical, conservative, known among colleagues for careful documentation and an aversion to speculation. His published research focused on mineral deposition and subterranean airflow, subjects that leave little room for conjecture. In interviews conducted years later, peers would describe him as disciplined to the point of rigidity, a man who trusted instruments more than intuition and records more than recollection. His field journal from that season begins as expected: weather conditions, equipment checks, travel times measured down to the minute, observations, recorded in a clipped, technical style devoid of personal reflection. The first several pages could belong to any number of routine surveys conducted throughout the Appalachian region during the mid-20th century. Then, the tone shifts. The change is subtle at first. A single line, noting an inconsistency between recorded cave depth and measured descent. An annotation in the margin questioning airflow direction. A brief comment about temperature stability that does not align with known patterns for shallow limestone systems. These notes are not emphasized. There are no exclamation points, no language suggesting alarm, just discrepancies, quietly recorded. According to the official log, the entry into the cave occurred shortly after mid-morning. Equipment was standard, light sources tested and functional, no indication of environmental distress. The cave mouth admitted a steady flow of cool air, consistent with subterranean circulation. The first section matched existing maps closely enough to inspire confidence in the documentation that preceded this visit. It was beyond that initial corridor that the instruments began to disagree with the maps. Depth readings extended beyond what should have been possible without encountering known terminal points. Acoustic tests produced returns that suggested open space far larger than any chamber previously recorded in this system. Most notably, time measurements began to drift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately draw attention, but enough that repeated checks became necessary. The field journal records several pauses taken solely to recalibrate equipment that, upon inspection, appeared to be functioning normally. There is a line, written midway down one page, that would later be cited repeatedly in internal reviews. It is the first sentence in the journal that departs from purely technical description. This section is not consistent with prior records. Nothing more, no elaboration. But the phrasing is precise, not unexplained, not unusual, not strange, not consistent. The cave walls in this deeper section showed signs of modification that did not match natural formation patterns. Tool marks were present, but they were old, smoothed by time and mineral buildup, no modern debris. No recent disturbance. The shaping suggested intent rather than erosion, yet there were no records of excavation or expansion associated with this site. According to public files, no one had ever worked this cave beyond cursory exploration. The air here behaved differently. Movement was minimal, as if the surrounding stone absorbed sound and motion alike. Drips that should have echoed fell silently. Even footsteps registered only faintly, dampened by an unseen quality that the journal struggles to describe without departing from scientific language. Temperature readings stabilized at a level inconsistent with depth, season, or airflow. The instruments recorded it accurately. The numbers were clear, but no explanation accompanied them. The final entry from that day ends abruptly. There is no closing summary, no notation of exit time, and no confirmation of return to the surface. The page simply stops, mid-paragraph, as if the act of writing had been interrupted. According to administrative records, the survey was completed. The assignment was marked as concluded. A short report was filed, stating that the cave presented no features of significant interest beyond minor mapping discrepancies. The language mirrors dozens of similar reports archived in the same year. What the report does not mention is the supplemental folder added weeks later, stamped restricted, and routed through a separate chain of custody. That folder contains transcriptions of private notes, correspondence never logged in official databases, and a request for reassignment that was denied without explanation. It also contains the first reference to something described only as the interior chamber, a term that does not appear in any public documentation related to this site. The private notes begin several days after the official report was filed, written on paper that does not match standard field issue stock. The margins are narrower, the ink is darker. The handwriting, while still controlled, shows signs of pressure, as if the writer was bearing down harder than necessary. These notes were not logged through normal channels. They were folded, placed inside an unmarked envelope, and later surfaced in a personnel archive under a classification code that did not exist elsewhere in the system. The first page does not describe the cave. It describes hesitation. The author notes a delay between leaving the site and completing the report, a delay that required justification under departmental policy. He attributes it, officially, to equipment recalibration and follow-up measurements. Privately, he records something else entirely: uncertainty about whether his recollection of the interior matched the data recorded by his instruments. This is the first instance in the file where memory itself becomes suspect. He lists measurements again, duplicating figures already present in the public report. Depth, temperature, humidity, airflow, all identical. Then, beneath them, he adds a separate column labeled Observed, Not Measured. The values do not align. In several cases, they contradict one another outright. He writes that the interior chamber, the one not shown on any map, appeared to possess defined boundaries that did not correspond to geological logic. The walls were smooth in places where erosion should have produced irregularity. Angles appeared where curves were expected. In one passage, he pauses to acknowledge that he is describing geometry that suggests planning rather than process, before crossing out the word planning and replacing it with arrangement. This distinction matters. Planning implies intent. Arrangement implies sequence. He records a sensation of compression upon entering the deeper section, not physical pressure but a perceptual narrowing. Sounds diminished. Peripheral awareness seemed reduced. He compares it to working under low ceilings for extended periods, despite the chamber itself being large enough to stand upright without obstruction. The instruments, again, showed nothing abnormal. Oxygen levels were stable. No toxins detected, yet the notes repeat one phrase in varied forms across multiple pages. The space does not behave as expected. A diagram follows. It is rough, clearly drawn from memory rather than direct observation. The chamber is depicted as elongated, with side passages branching at irregular intervals. What stands out are the markings. Small symbols placed along the walls, evenly spaced, identical in shape, but varied in orientation. The author notes that they were not carvings in the conventional sense. No tool marks, no debris. Instead, the stone itself appeared altered, as if the symbols had been impressed before the rock fully hardened. There is no attempt to interpret their meaning, only a count. 37 markings in total, distributed in a pattern that repeats every several meters. The next section of the notes addresses time. He records checking his watch upon entering the chamber and again upon exiting, noting a discrepancy of approximately 40 minutes that cannot be accounted for by the duration of his documented activity. He initially attributes this to fatigue or distraction, but later entries suggest the discrepancy persisted across multiple checks. His watch was tested afterward. It functioned normally. More troubling is his observation that the light behaved differently within the chamber. Shadows did not fall consistently. The beam from his headlamp appeared to flatten against surfaces rather than scatter. He describes the sensation of illumination without reflection, as though the chamber absorbed light rather than revealing itself through it. At this point, the tone of the notes shifts again. The language becomes less technical and more cautious. He writes that he did not feel afraid in the conventional sense. There was no panic, no immediate threat. Instead, he describes a growing conviction that remaining in the chamber longer than necessary would constitute an error, though he cannot articulate why. He leaves. What follows is a series of communications between departments, requests for peer review of the data, inquiries about previous surveys of the site, quiet questions about whether any classified work had ever been conducted in the region. Each receives a response that is polite, professional, and unhelpful. No additional records, no corroborating data, no acknowledgement that the chamber might exist. One memo, marked internal use only, suggests that the discrepancies could be attributed to instrument drift or cognitive fatigue associated with extended solo fieldwork. It recommends no further action. The author does not accept this explanation. His notes show a methodical attempt to disprove his own conclusions. He revisits the cave entrance alone, though he does not re-enter. He conducts surface measurements, acoustic tests. Everything aligns with expectations. It is as if the anomaly exists only beyond a threshold he is no longer willing to cross without authorization. That authorization never comes. Instead, he is instructed to archive his supplemental notes and move on to other assignments. The directive is phrased as routine workload management. There is no mention of restriction or concern. But attached to the instruction is a routing code that places the notes under limited access, viewable only by supervisors, with clearance that exceeds what the assignment should require. The final page of the private notes contains a single paragraph written weeks later. It is not dated. If the chamber is not recorded, it does not exist. If it does not exist, it cannot be studied. If it cannot be studied, it cannot be explained. This resolves the problem administratively, not materially. Beneath that, a final line, underlined once. The space remains. No further entries appear in his handwriting after that point. Subsequent documents indicate a reassignment to surface-based analysis work far from the region. His name does not appear on any additional subterranean surveys for the remainder of his career. The cave, according to public records, remains unchanged, classified as shallow, inactive, of no particular interest. But the restricted file continues to grow. The next set of documents enters the archive years later, quietly appended to the original file without revision or annotation. They do not originate from the same hand. The formatting is different. The language is less cautious, less restrained. These pages belong to a secondary review conducted under a separate mandate, one that does not appear in any public index of investigations from that period. The review begins with a familiar justification: reassessment of legacy data, verification of archived measurements, routine consolidation of historical surveys. The stated purpose is administrative efficiency. But the internal routing codes tell a different story. This review bypasses regional oversight entirely and is forwarded directly through a chain reserved for material considered sensitive but unresolved. The reviewer notes immediately that the original public report and the private notes cannot be reconciled through error correction alone. Instrument drift, fatigue, and transcription mistakes are dismissed early, not because they are impossible, but because they fail to account for the consistency of the anomalies across multiple categories of data. Depth, temperature, acoustics, and timekeeping all diverge in ways that correlate spatially rather than randomly. This correlation becomes the review's central concern. The reviewer reconstructs the original descent using archived maps and terrain models overlaying the reported path with known geological formations. According to these reconstructions, the interior chamber described in the private notes would have to occupy space already filled by solid limestone. There is no void where the chamber should be, no collapse zone, no recorded cavity. The rock, on paper, is continuous, and yet the measurements insist otherwise. The review includes a controlled experiment conducted at a different site with similar geological characteristics. Instruments are tested under identical conditions. No anomalies are observed. Time discrepancies do not recur. Light behaves normally. Sound reflects as expected. The implication is clear. The instruments are not at fault. The reviewer then turns to the symbols. Using the rough diagram preserved in the private notes, the reviewer extrapolates spacing and orientation, comparing them to known natural formations and documented cultural markings. No match is found. The symbols do not correspond to known indigenous petroglyphs, mining marks, or survey indicators. Their uniformity suggests standardization, yet there is no record of a system that would produce such markings underground without leaving evidence of activity. One paragraph stands out in this section, heavily redacted in later copies, but partially legible in the earliest version. The marks appear to serve no communicative function. They do not instruct. They do not warn. They do not identify ownership. Their placement suggests presence rather than purpose. The reviewer's language grows more tentative here, adopting qualifiers that had been absent earlier. Phrases like appears to, may, indicate, and cannot be ruled out become more frequent. This shift coincides with a change in recommendations. Rather than dismissing the chamber, the reviewer proposes a controlled re-entry. The proposal is careful, limited in scope, and framed as a verification exercise rather than an exploration. A two-person team, redundant instruments, fixed duration exposure, no excavation, no modification of the site. The goal is simply to confirm whether the reported space can be accessed again under observation. The proposal is denied. The denial memo is brief. It cites budgetary constraints, competing priorities, and the lack of actionable benefit. It notes that no public safety concerns have been identified. It suggests that the matter has been adequately addressed by existing documentation. The reviewer responds with a follow-up, less formal, routed through a different channel. In it, They argue that the lack of public safety concerns is itself contingent on the assumption that the chamber does not exist. They point out that if the space behaves as described, it represents a geological anomaly with unknown implications for stability, navigation, and environmental assessment. This response receives no reply. Instead, the file is reclassified. The classification does not elevate the material to top-tier secrecy, but it restricts access enough to ensure that further review requires explicit authorization. The reason given is protection of sensitive geological data. No mention is made of symbols, time discrepancies, or perceptual effects. What follows is the most troubling entry in the file. A handwritten statement, unsigned, dated several months after the review concludes. It is written in a style distinct from both the original surveyor and the reviewer. The handwriting is looser, less precise. The tone is urgent. It describes an unauthorized visit. According to the statement, an individual with prior knowledge of the case entered the cave without formal approval, carrying only minimal equipment. The stated intention was not to document, but to confirm. The statement claims that the entrance appeared unchanged, but that the interior route differed subtly from memory. Passages seemed longer. Turns occurred where none had before. The chamber was reached. The statement confirms its presence. It corroborates the temperature stability, the acoustic absorption, and the altered behavior of light. It also introduces a new detail not present in earlier notes. The symbols were no longer uniform. Some had been altered. Others appeared partially obscured, not by mineral buildup, but by what the writer describes as surface smoothing, inconsistent with erosion. The count no longer matched the original diagram. The statement ends abruptly, mid-sentence. There is no indication of exit or return. No follow-up. No record of the author's identity. After this entry, the file goes silent for nearly a decade. No additional reviews, no new memos, no reassessments. The cave remains listed as inactive. The chamber is never acknowledged publicly. The original surveyor retires quietly. The reviewer transfers to a different department. The unauthorized entry is never referenced again, but the silence itself becomes a pattern. Years later, when the archive is digitized, the system flags this file repeatedly for access attempts. Requests originate from multiple regions and multiple departments, none of which officially deal with subterranean research. Each request is denied automatically. The final annotation in this section of the file is a system-generated note, added without human commentary. Access frequency exceeds baseline expectations. The next phase of the record does not announce itself as a continuation. There is no header, no formal linkage, and no explicit acknowledgement that what follows relates to the cave at all. Instead, the connection emerges indirectly through marginal notes, cross-referenced dates, and the quiet reuse of terminology that would not recur if the earlier material had truly been set aside. It begins with a cluster of incident summaries drawn from unrelated departments, environmental assessments, infrastructure inspections, search and rescue after-action reports. Individually, they appear ordinary. Together, they form a pattern that only becomes visible when viewed through the lens of the suppressed file. The first incident involves a routine bridge inspection conducted several miles from the cave site. The inspection report notes unexpected subsidence readings beneath one support column, inconsistent with known erosion models for the area. Ground-penetrating scans indicate a void beneath the structure, though geological surveys show no record of caverns in that location. The report recommends monitoring but does not escalate the finding. In the margin of the digitized copy, someone has written a single word, interior. The second incident comes from a forestry patrol log. A ranger reports disorientation while navigating a familiar trail system, describing repeated loops that should not have been possible given the terrain. The patrol lasted longer than scheduled, despite no deviation from planned routes. Timestamps in the log do not align with GPS data recorded later. The discrepancy is noted, then dismissed as a clerical error. A handwritten note appears beside the dismissal, threshold behavior. A third report documents an unexplained temperature anomaly recorded during a groundwater sampling operation. The readings stabilize at a level inconsistent with depth and season, matching almost exactly the figures recorded in the cave's private notes years earlier. The anomaly is localized, persistent, and resistant to explanation. The site is capped and removed from the sampling rotation. No explanation is provided. These incidents are not officially linked. There is no memo proposing a common cause, no task force, no coordinated response. Yet the language used to describe them begins to converge. Words like stable, contained, and non-propagating recur across multiple documents, often in contexts where such assurances are unnecessary. A later internal review focused on system-wide data anomalies highlights this convergence indirectly. It notes that certain regions exhibit what it terms measurement coherence without explanatory substrate. In plain terms, readings agree with each other, but not with reality as modeled. The reviewer does not speculate. They do not mention the cave, but they flag the region for conceptual reevaluation, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the archive. Around this time, access logs show renewed interest in the restricted file. Attempts originate from offices concerned with land use planning, infrastructure resilience, and emergency management. None are granted. The automated denial responses include a boilerplate justification, insufficient relevance. What follows is a deposition transcript taken years later as part of an unrelated inquiry. The subject is a retired field technician questioned about historical anomalies encountered during routine work. The technician speaks cautiously, often qualifying statements with uncertainty. But when asked about spaces that behave differently, the language changes. He describes entering areas where sound seemed to flatten, where equipment readings stabilized unnaturally, and where movement felt constrained despite no physical obstruction. He insists these were isolated experiences, easily dismissed at the time. But he admits that they were never reported formally, not because they lacked significance, but because there was no category in which to place them. They didn't fit, he says, so they didn't go anywhere. The transcript notes a pause at this point. The subject asks whether the question is hypothetical. The interviewer does not answer. The most explicit connection appears in a memorandum drafted by an analyst reviewing historical incident clusters. The memo does not mention the cave directly, but it references a documented subterranean anomaly previously classified as inactive. It suggests that this anomaly may represent a persistent condition rather than a discrete event. The memo proposes a reframing. Instead of viewing the chamber as a location, it suggests viewing it as a state, a configuration of space that can manifest under certain conditions, independent of fixed geography. This proposal is not endorsed. It is not rejected either. It is simply filed. Shortly afterward, the analyst transfers departments. The memo is reclassified. The pattern continues quietly. Reports of disorientation, time discrepancies, measurement stabilization without cause. Each is addressed locally, contained administratively, and disconnected from any broader context. The absence of escalation becomes its own form of management. The archive begins to show signs of internal strain. Cross-references that should exist do not. File paths terminate unexpectedly. Index entries point to documents that cannot be accessed, even by administrators. A system audit notes these inconsistencies and attributes them to legacy data migration issues. One audit comment stands out. Certain records resist normalization. This language is unusual. Systems do not resist. Data does not object. Yet the phrasing persists across multiple technical reviews. The final document in this section is a draft policy recommendation never formally adopted. It argues for the creation of a new classification category for phenomena that are geographically anchored but behaviorally mobile. The examples cited are heavily redacted but the criteria align closely with the characteristics of the chamber. The recommendation concludes with a cautionary note. It warns that continued reliance on administrative closure in the face of unresolved anomalies may produce blind spots with cumulative effects. It suggests that absence of incident should not be mistaken for absence of influence. The policy is not implemented. The file returns to silence. The shift from physical anomaly to human effect is not announced. It emerges gradually, threaded through documents that were never intended to be read together. Psychological evaluations, performance reviews, exit interviews. Each appears routine. None mention the cave, and yet the language begins to echo. The first indication comes from a set of occupational health assessments conducted among field personnel assigned to the region over a span of several years. The assessments were standardized and designed to track fatigue, stress, and cognitive load in remote assignments. Most entries fall within expected ranges. A few do not. Several individuals report difficulty recalling sequences of routine tasks, despite no measurable impairment in attention or memory on formal testing. Others describe a persistent sense of anticipatory caution, an inclination to avoid certain routes or locations without being able to articulate a reason. One assessment notes a technician who repeatedly altered his field plans to avoid a specific hollow, despite no prior incidents or hazards recorded there. The clinician conducting the evaluation attributes these behaviors to environmental stress and isolation. The recommendation is rest and rotation. No further inquiry is made. A performance review from the same period includes a marginal note questioning an employee's situational judgment. The employee had deviated from standard procedure by terminating a survey early, citing an inability to reconcile instrument readings with physical surroundings. The deviation is marked as an error, though the reviewer acknowledges that no adverse outcome resulted. The employee is reassigned. In an exit interview conducted years later, a different individual mentions experiencing what they describe as spatial pressure during certain assignments. They clarify that they do not mean claustrophobia. There were no enclosed spaces. Instead, they felt as though the environment itself imposed constraints on decision-making, narrowing options without presenting explicit threats. The interviewer notes the comment, but does not pursue it. What becomes apparent through cross-referencing is that these reports clustered geographically, overlapping with the broader region associated with the original cave site. Not precisely, not exclusively, but often enough to suggest more than coincidence. A confidential memorandum from a human factors analyst attempts to address this clustering. The analyst observes that affected individuals demonstrate intact cognitive function, no evidence of psychosis, and no consistent stressors beyond those typical of remote fieldwork. Yet their narratives share common elements: altered perception of space, difficulty prioritizing actions, and a heightened sensitivity to environmental cues that others do not register. The analyst proposes that these effects may be related to prolonged exposure to environments with atypical sensory feedback. Areas where sound, light, and spatial orientation behave differently could, over time, recalibrate perceptual expectations. This recalibration might persist even after leaving the environment. The memorandum includes a parenthetical remark that would later be removed from subsequent copies. Comparable to reported effects near the inactive subterranean site. The remark is crossed out in pen. The analyst's recommendation is modest: increased monitoring, optional debriefings, no mention of the cave, no suggestion of causation. The goal is to track whether the pattern persists. The recommendation is not adopted. Instead, the file records a subtle change in assignment practices. Certain personnel are no longer scheduled for extended solo work in specific areas. Routes are adjusted. Survey boundaries shift slightly. No explanation is provided, even to those affected. The changes are framed as logistical optimizations. At the same time, access attempts to the restricted file increase again. This time, some originate from offices concerned with behavioral research and decision science. The requests cite interest in environmental effects on cognition. they are denied. The most direct acknowledgement of the human dimension appears in a set of handwritten notes recovered from the personal effects of a senior administrator who had oversight of multiple departments during the period in question. The notes are not part of any official record. They were found among unrelated materials and only digitized years later. In one entry, the administrator reflects on places that shape behavior without instruction. They speculate that certain environments exert influence not through threat or reward, but through constraint, limiting the range of perceived options until compliance feels like choice. The entry continues. If such a place existed, it would not need to act, it would only need to remain. There is no reference to the cave, no indication of how the administrator arrived at this line of thought. The entry is not followed up. The archive then records an unusual procedural change. A new internal guideline is circulated, advising managers to avoid assigning individuals with prior exposure to anomalous environments to roles requiring rapid decision-making under uncertainty. The guideline cites general best practices. No specific case studies are mentioned. The timing of the guideline aligns closely with the period during which the cave file saw the highest number of access attempts. The most unsettling document in this section is a transcript from a closed-door meeting convened to discuss persistent regional anomalies. The transcript is heavily redacted, but certain phrases remain visible. References to behavioral drift, non-pathological compliance, and environmental shaping appear repeatedly. One speaker warns against overinterpretation, arguing that humans are adept at finding patterns where none exist. Another counters that the consistency of the reports suggests a common factor that has not been adequately identified. A third voice, attributed only to a senior official, ends the discussion with a directive. We are not equipped to address this at the systems level. Containment remains the appropriate response. The meeting adjourns. No action items are recorded. What the archive shows, in aggregate, is not panic or conspiracy, but a gradual accommodation, an unspoken agreement to work around something that cannot be resolved, to adjust behavior without acknowledging cause. The cave remains classified as inactive. The chamber remains unrecorded, yet its characteristics appear to ripple outward, not through physical expansion, but through subtle influence on those who come close enough to notice. The near exposure begins not with a discovery, but with a question asked by someone who did not know which files to avoid. The inquiry arrives from outside the usual channels, submitted as part of a broader research request into historical anomalies in environmental data. The requester is not affiliated with any of the departments that had previously attempted access. Their justification is narrow, technical, and difficult to deny without drawing attention. The request is partially granted. What the requester receives is a curated subset of public records, stripped of annotations, cross-references, and restricted appendices. On its own, the material appears benign. A shallow cave survey. Minor discrepancies are attributed to equipment limitations. No further action required. The expectation is that the requester will find nothing of interest and move on. They don't. Instead, they notice something the internal reviewers had grown accustomed to ignoring: a mismatch between the language used to close the case and the volume of documentation generated around it. For a site deemed inactive, the administrative footprint is unusually large. There are too many memos, too many access logs, too many classification changes for something that supposedly amounted to nothing. The requester submits a follow-up, asking for clarification on the discrepancy. This time, the request is denied. That denial triggers a different response. The requester files a separate inquiry under a transparency statute, requesting metadata rather than content. They ask not for documents, but for a list of document types associated with the site. The request is legally sound. It cannot be refused outright without justification. The resulting metadata release is limited, but it reveals enough to raise concern. The file contains categories that should not apply to a routine survey. Behavioral assessment, Infrastructure impact. Policy review. The requester does not know what these categories contain, but they know they should not be there. They begin to ask questions publicly. The questions are careful, academic, framed as curiosity rather than accusation. They post a short paper noting inconsistencies in archival handling of certain Appalachian survey sites, suggesting that some locations may have been administratively minimized rather than scientifically resolved. The paper does not mention the cave by name. It does not speculate about the cause. It simply points out gaps. The response is swift and quiet. The paper is accepted for presentation at a regional conference, then withdrawn without explanation. The requester receives a polite notice citing scheduling constraints. No further details are provided. At the same time, internal correspondence shows a flurry of activity around the restricted file. Access permissions are reviewed. Logging thresholds are adjusted. Automated alerts are modified to flag not just access attempts, but also inquiries about access attempts. One memo notes that the file's existence has become discoverable through inference, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the archive. The memo recommends consolidation. What consolidation means in practice is fragmentation. The file is split. Portions are migrated to separate repositories under different classification schemes. Cross-references are removed. Identifiers are changed. The cave is no longer a single object in the system, but a set of disconnected records that only align if viewed together. This strategy works temporarily. The requester, unable to access further material, shifts focus. They begin interviewing retired personnel, relying on publicly available information to identify individuals who may have worked in the region during the relevant period. Most decline to comment. A few agree to speak off the record. One such conversation is later summarized in the requester's private notes, which would only surface years later. The summary describes a former fieldworker who recalls being advised informally to avoid certain depths during surveys. When pressed for details, the worker becomes uncomfortable, stating that the advice was never written down and never explained. "It wasn't about danger," the worker reportedly says. "It was about not getting stuck thinking about it." Another interviewee mentions a supervisor who used to say, half-jokingly, that some places want you to finish what you start, though the speaker cannot recall what that meant. The requester never publishes these accounts. They remain in personal notes, unverified and circumstantial. The most significant development comes from a separate incident entirely. A landslide occurs near a different cave system, prompting emergency geological assessment. During the assessment, sensors record a zone of stable temperature and acoustic dampening beneath the slide, characteristics that match those documented in the restricted file. The assessment team notes the similarity in an internal report. They do not know about the cave. They simply flag the anomaly as unusual. The report is escalated. This escalation triggers an automated cross-check that links the new anomaly to the older, fragmented records. For the first time in years, the system itself reconnects pieces that had been deliberately separated. An internal alert is generated, noting a match between historical and current data signatures. The alert is acknowledged, then closed. No field team is dispatched. No public notice is issued. The landslide site is stabilized and declared secure. The anomaly is attributed to localized conditions, but the alert leaves a trace. It appears in a system log that is later accessed during a routine audit. The auditor, unfamiliar with the history, flags the closure as insufficiently documented. They request justification. This request does not go unanswered. Instead, it prompts a rare in-person meeting between representatives from multiple departments. The meeting notes, heavily redacted, indicate concern about pattern reactivation. One participant warns that continued suppression may increase the risk of uncontrolled exposure, not of the anomaly itself, but of the institutional response to it. Another participant counters that acknowledgement would create expectations of explanation that cannot be met. The meeting ends without resolution. The requester, unaware of these developments, eventually abandons their inquiry. Their career moves in a different direction. The paper remains unpublished. The cave remains inactive. But the archive does not forget. The system logs show that, from this point onward, the restricted file is accessed less frequently but more deliberately. Each access is brief, targeted, as if users know exactly what they are looking for and where to find it. The final entry in this phase of the record is a short administrative note attached to the fragmented files. Risk of inadvertent synthesis remains non-zero. No author is listed. The consequences do not arrive as a single event. They accumulate. Small deviations at first, easily absorbed by systems designed to smooth irregularities. A delayed report. An unexplained reassignment. A procedural exception granted without record. Each is defensible on its own. Together, they begin to strain the assumption that containment is neutral. The earliest indication appears in land use planning documents prepared years after the original survey. A proposed infrastructure project intersects a zone flagged repeatedly for minor inconsistencies. Nothing severe enough to halt development, but enough to require additional review. The review notes that subsurface models for the area cannot be reconciled with surface stability metrics. The recommendation is to reroute slightly, avoiding the most problematic section. The reroute is approved. What is not noted publicly is that the problematic section aligns closely with the extrapolated projection of the chamber's reported orientation, extended beyond the cave's mapped boundary. The alignment is not exact. It does not need to be. It is close enough to raise questions that no one formally asks. A separate document from a utilities assessment records an unusual maintenance pattern. Equipment installed near the same zone requires recalibration more frequently than identical equipment elsewhere. The issue is attributed to environmental wear. Replacement parts are ordered. No investigation follows. At the same time, personnel records begin to show a subtle trend. Individuals who have worked repeatedly in the affected region exhibit higher rates of transfer requests, early retirement, or shifts to roles with reduced field exposure. Exit interviews cite vague dissatisfaction, fatigue, or a desire for stability. None mention specific incidents. One interview stands out. The departing employee describes a sense of unfinished tasks associated with the region, despite having completed all assigned work. They report recurring dreams of navigating spaces that do not resolve, corridors that extend without destination. The interviewer notes the comment, then moves on. The psychological dimension remains officially unaddressed. The first operational failure linked directly to the pattern occurs during an emergency response exercise. A simulated search and rescue operation is conducted in rugged terrain overlapping the broader anomaly zone. The exercise is routine, designed to test coordination and navigation under stress. Several teams report difficulty maintaining orientation. Checkpoints are missed. Timelines slip. One team reports reaching a waypoint earlier than scheduled, then finding it unoccupied, as if they had arrived ahead of themselves. The discrepancy is corrected in the final report by adjusting timestamps. During the debrief, a team leader remarks that the area doesn't want to be finished with, a phrase that draws uncomfortable laughter. No one follows up. The after-action report recommends additional training. Internally, however, a different conversation takes place. An analyst reviewing the exercise data notes that the navigation errors cluster spatially, overlapping with previously flagged zones. The analyst prepares a brief, suggesting that certain areas may introduce cognitive load beyond what standard training accounts for. The brief is not circulated. Instead, a directive is issued, limiting the use of those areas for exercises unless necessary. The justification is environmental preservation. Around this time, the restricted file sees a change in how it is referenced internally. Earlier documents describe it as a case. Later ones refer to it as a condition. The distinction is subtle but significant. A case can be closed. A condition persists. A policy draft proposes formalizing this distinction, creating a category for persistent spatial anomalies with indirect effects. The draft outlines management strategies focused on avoidance, documentation without synthesis, and personnel rotation to minimize prolonged exposure. The draft is never finalized. The reason, according to margin notes, is concern that formal recognition would require disclosure to oversight bodies, triggering questions that cannot be answered satisfactorily. The most revealing document from this period is a training memo circulated quietly among senior staff. It advises leaders to monitor for signs of decision fatigue unrelated to workload among personnel assigned to certain regions. It suggests proactive reassignment before performance degrades. The memo includes a line that would later be removed from archived copies. Do not encourage individuals to seek explanatory narratives. This instruction is not elaborated, it does not need to be. The cumulative effect of these measures is a form of institutional adaptation. Systems bend around the anomaly, routing activity away from it, reallocating human attention, and normalizing minor inefficiencies as acceptable costs. The chamber remains unacknowledged, yet its influence shapes behavior at multiple levels. The tipping point comes with a proposal to reopen the cave as part of a broader recreational initiative. The proposal originates from a regional development office unaware of the site's history. On paper, it makes sense. The cave is shallow, inactive, and located near potential tourist infrastructure. The proposal triggers internal review. The response is disproportionate. Multiple departments object, citing safety, conservation, and logistical concerns. None mention the chamber. The objections are coordinated, though no single office appears to lead them. The proposal is withdrawn. In a follow-up email, a junior planner asks why the cave, among many similar sites, elicited such resistance. The reply is brief. Historical complications. No further explanation is given. That same year, a minor incident occurs when a group of unauthorized explorers enters the cave after hours. They are found hours later, disoriented but unharmed. They report that the cave seemed larger than expected and that they lost track of time. Their account is dismissed as inexperience. The incident report is filed and closed, but someone attached it to the restricted file. The attachment includes a handwritten note. Public exposure risk remains manageable. The language echoes earlier memos. The tone is calm, controlled. Yet the implication is clear. Management has shifted from understanding to mitigation, from inquiry to containment. The chamber, whatever it is, continues to exist, not as a place acknowledged, but as a factor accounted for indirectly. Its presence is inferred through the adjustments made to avoid it, the policies written to manage around it, and the quiet consensus that some spaces should not be revisited. The archive does not forget, but it does reorganize. Over time, documents migrate, file codes change, storage protocols update. What was once centralized becomes distributed, and what was once sequential becomes associative. In this process, meaning can thin without disappearing entirely. It becomes harder to trace, easier to overlook, and more resistant to synthesis. The restricted file enters this phase quietly. Its contents are digitized as part of a broader modernization initiative. Scans are performed according to standard procedure. Metadata is applied. Access controls are replicated in the new system. On paper, nothing is lost. In practice, something shifts. The digitization fragments the file's internal logic. Earlier, the physical arrangement had imposed a kind of narrative order. Reports followed one another. Marginal notes accumulated visibly. Contradictions sat side by side, unresolved but unmistakable. In the digital environment, documents are indexed individually. Cross-references depend on tags. Context becomes optional. A later reviewer searching for a specific term retrieves a handful of documents but misses others that would have complicated the picture. Another reviewer accesses a different subset and reaches a different conclusion. Neither is wrong. Neither is complete. This diffusion mirrors the earlier institutional response. No single decision erases the anomaly. Instead, its edges blur. An internal audit flags this issue indirectly. The audit notes that several legacy files resist clear categorization and recommends either consolidation or retirement. The restricted file is listed among them. The recommendation is deferred. Around this time, a new generation of analysts begins encountering references they do not fully understand. Phrases recur across unrelated documents, mentions of spatial inconsistency, notes about cognitive load, warnings against explanatory narratives. These phrases are not defined, they are inherited. One analyst attempts to trace their origin. The trail leads back through decades of correspondence, memos, and procedural notes, each referencing the last without elaboration. Eventually, the trail reaches the digitized scan of the original field notes. The analyst reads them carefully. In a private annotation, they write that the notes feel less like observations and more like negotiations, as if the observer were attempting to stabilize something that resists being fixed. The analyst questions whether the anomaly was ever truly contained or whether it simply exceeded the framework used to describe it. The annotation is saved locally. It is not uploaded to the shared system. Elsewhere, unrelated research begins to intersect the pattern unintentionally. Studies on human navigation in low-visibility environments report anomalies that cannot be fully explained by stress or fatigue. Participants describe spatial compression, extended durations without corresponding physical distance, and a sense of environments holding them. The studies are published in technical journals. No connection is made publicly. Internally, however, someone notices the overlap. A comparison document is drafted, aligning the study findings with excerpts from the restricted file. The document is labeled speculative. It circulates briefly among a small group. The response is mixed. Some dismiss it as coincidence. Others express discomfort. One senior reviewer advises against formalizing the comparison, noting that it risks creating a narrative where none has been officially established. The document is archived without action. The pattern continues in subtle ways. Equipment malfunctions in regions with similar geological profiles. Reports of disorientation surface during unrelated fieldwork. Each incident is isolated, explained, and resolved within its own context. But the accumulation is noticeable to those who look for it. The most striking parallel emerges from an entirely different domain. A data integrity team reviews anomalies in time-stamped records from remote monitoring stations. Certain stations report sequences that appear internally consistent but externally misaligned. Events register out of expected order. Durations overlap slightly. The discrepancies are small. They fall within acceptable margins, yet they recur at specific locations. When mapped, those locations form a loose pattern, not a precise shape but a tendency, a clustering that suggests something other than random error. The team prepares a report. It focuses on calibration issues and environmental interference. The deeper implications remain unspoken. A margin note appears on the final page. Recommend continued observation without intervention. The phrase echoes earlier guidance almost exactly. At this point, the restricted file has effectively become a reference without a subject. It is cited but not read, accessed but not synthesized. Its influence persists through institutional habits rather than explicit knowledge. The original chamber is never reopened. Its physical presence fades from operational awareness. Vegetation reclaims the entrance. Signage weathers. Maps omit it. Yet the logic that formed around it remains active. New policies are written with language that accommodates uncertainty without naming it. Training emphasizes adaptability over precision in certain environments. Data analysis frameworks include allowances for anomalies that cannot be modeled directly. None of this is attributed to a single cause. The final document added to the restricted file before its access tier is downgraded is a brief memo summarizing the file's status. It notes that no further action is planned and that existing controls appear sufficient. The memo concludes with a sentence that stands apart from the rest. Absence of escalation should not be interpreted as resolution. There is no signature. Years later, when a researcher requests access to the file as part of a historical review, the request is denied. The justification cites relevance. The file is deemed peripheral to current priorities. The researcher appeals. The appeal is acknowledged but never answered. What remains is not a story in the conventional sense. It is a residue, a pattern of avoidance, adjustment, and quiet agreement that some findings do not belong in circulation. The chamber, whether physical or conceptual, has been absorbed into the architecture of decision-making. It no longer needs to be seen to exert influence. And that may be the most enduring consequence of all. Not the anomaly itself, but the way institutions learn to move around it, preserving function while surrendering comprehension. The first sign that the pattern has slipped its institutional boundaries comes not through official channels, but through coincidence. Independent researchers, working without access to classified archives or restricted files, begin noticing irregularities that echo older descriptions almost verbatim. They do not reference the original case. They cannot. They describe something adjacent to it, approaching from entirely different directions. One publishes a paper on subterranean acoustics in karst environments, noting that certain cave systems appear to amplify not sound, but absence. Measurements taken inside specific formations show unexpected attenuation patterns, as though sound is being redirected rather than absorbed. The effect is subtle. The author describes it as a negative resonance, a term that attracts little attention. Another researcher, focused on human spatial cognition, documents instances where participants navigating underground passages report altered perceptions of sequence. They remember turning left before reaching an intersection that, by all physical measures, should have come later. These are not hallucinations. They are consistent errors, repeating across subjects unfamiliar with one another. A third researcher, working in archival science, presents a conference talk on the degradation of narrative coherence in long-term records. She argues that certain files seem to resist synthesis not because of missing data, but because of surplus. Too many fragments, too many cross-references, arranged in ways that frustrate linear reconstruction. None of these researchers are aware of one another. The convergence becomes apparent only later, when a journalist compiling a retrospective on unresolved scientific anomalies notices the overlap. The journalist is careful and methodical. They avoid sensationalism. They frame the piece as a study in limits, focusing on how institutions respond to findings that strain explanatory frameworks. In the course of research, the journalist files multiple information requests. Most are denied. A few are partially fulfilled. Among the materials received is a heavily redacted index referencing a legacy file, its title removed, its contents summarized only as Spatial Irregularity Investigation. The journalist follows the trail as far as it goes. In private notes, later recovered from a personal archive, the journalist writes that the index feels familiar, as though it points towards something already known, but deliberately unnamed. They speculate that the file represents not a singular incident, but a node in a larger network of observations never brought together. The article is published without reference to the file. Still, the ripple spreads. Online forums dedicated to cave exploration and remote research begin sharing anecdotal accounts that echo earlier patterns. Explorers describe passages that feel longer on the way out than on the way in. They report losing track of time without experiencing panic. Some mention finding markings that appear deliberate but do not correspond to known systems of notation. These posts are met with skepticism. The explanations offered are mundane: fatigue, poor lighting, confirmation bias. The discussions fade, but the accounts persist. In one thread, a user posts a photograph of a narrow chamber with an odd geometry. The image is grainy. The scale is difficult to judge. Commenters argue about perspective. A few remark that the space seems wrong, though they cannot articulate why. The post is removed for violating community guidelines. Meanwhile, a graduate student conducting a historical review of land use policy notices an anomaly in zoning decisions related to protected cave systems. Certain sites appear to have been quietly excluded from development repeatedly, despite lacking clear justification. The pattern spans decades and administrations. The student drafts a thesis chapter exploring this phenomenon. The advisor suggests narrowing the focus. The chapter is cut. The cumulative effect of these independent observations is not clarity, but pressure. The sense that something unresolved continues to surface, not in dramatic revelations, but in persistent misalignments. A feeling shared across disciplines that certain environments do not behave as expected, and that the response to this fact has been to look away. The original chamber remains absent from all public discourse. Its coordinates are not listed. Its designation does not appear in accessible registries. It exists only indirectly, inferred through the actions taken to avoid it and the echoes of its characteristics elsewhere. In recent years, a shift has occurred. Advances in remote sensing and modeling allow researchers to analyze subsurface environments with unprecedented precision. Algorithms detect patterns humans might miss. Data sets grow dense enough to reveal structures that defy earlier assumptions. A preliminary model flags a region of interest. The anomaly is subtle, but statistically significant. The model suggests spatial behavior inconsistent with known geological processes. The region overlaps with an area long marked by administrative hesitation. The finding escalated. This time, the response is cautious but attentive. The data is reviewed by multiple teams. Alternative explanations are proposed and tested. None fully account for the pattern. A decision is made to initiate a carefully framed project with limited scope. The language used mirrors earlier containment strategies. Though the context has shifted, there is talk of non-standard environments and adaptive frameworks. The investigation is approved, then delayed. In the interim, an internal discussion surfaces a question that had not been formally asked before. What if the original anomaly was not an isolated failure of measurement or understanding, but an early indication of a category error? What if the assumption that space behaves uniformly in all contexts is itself flawed? The question is not answered. It lingers. The journalist's unpublished notes, the student's cut chapter, the forum posts, and the research papers all point toward the same conclusion without stating it directly: that there are places that resist not just exploration but explanation, and that the cost of acknowledging them may be higher than institutions are willing to pay. The pattern is no longer confined to the past. It is active. It is being rediscovered by those who do not know what they are rediscovering. And that brings the story to the present moment, where the question is no longer whether something should not exist, but whether we are prepared to recognize it if it does. Recognition does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as friction, a slight resistance in systems designed to move smoothly, a hesitation in language that once flowed without difficulty. By the time something is recognized, it has already been accommodated in quieter ways. The renewed investigation never fully begins. It exists in drafts, in provisional budgets, and in carefully worded proposals that circulate and then stall. The reasons vary: competing priorities, shifting leadership, external pressures. Each delay is justified. Together, they form a familiar pattern. What has changed is not access to the site, but access to comparison. Researchers now possess enough distributed data to see similarities across regions that were once considered isolated. The patterns do not align cleanly. They are not identical, but they rhyme. Certain environments exhibit behaviors that resist linear mapping. Certain records resist consolidation. Certain observers report changes not in what they see, but in how long it takes to see it. These are not anomalies in isolation. They are deviations that recur under specific conditions. The language used to describe them grows more careful. In one internal briefing, the term non-Euclidean response appears, quickly followed by qualifiers and disclaimers. It is framed as metaphor, not assertion. The author emphasizes that no violation of physical law is implied, only a mismatch between expectation and outcome. The briefing is circulated, then quietly withdrawn. A separate group proposes a new classification framework, one that allows for environments to be treated as active variables rather than passive backdrops. The framework borrows concepts from systems theory and cognitive science. It suggests that space itself may participate in shaping experience in ways not captured by existing models. The proposal is acknowledged. It is not adopted. What remains consistent is the avoidance of synthesis. Data is gathered, but not unified. Studies are funded, but scoped narrowly. Findings are published, but stripped of implication. The machinery of inquiry continues to function, yet it moves as if constrained by invisible boundaries. Those closest to the work feel it first. Analysts report difficulty maintaining focus when reviewing certain data sets. They describe a sense of circularity, of revisiting the same questions without progress. Supervisors encourage breaks, reassignment, and wellness protocols. No one mentions the chamber. Outside institutional walls, the pattern continues to surface. Explorers recount experiences they cannot fully explain. Scholars encounter records that refuse to cohere. Communities living near remote sites share stories that echo older ones passed down without context, stripped of origin. These accounts are not dramatic. They are quiet, ordinary. They describe places that feel unfinished, paths that seem to lead elsewhere without distance, and silences that persist longer than expected. The danger, if it exists, is not immediate harm. It is erosion, a gradual adjustment of expectations until the inexplicable becomes normalized, not because it is understood, but because it is endured. The original chamber remains sealed, both physically and conceptually. Its coordinates are absent from public maps. Its name, if it ever had one, is not spoken, yet its influence persists, diffused through policy, research practice, and cultural memory. In a final note added to the restricted file before it was effectively frozen, an unknown author wrote a single sentence beneath a summary of unresolved issues. The absence of recurrence would have been easier to manage. The sentence is never referenced again. What that implies is left unstated. Perhaps recurrence was expected, perhaps it was observed, or perhaps the true concern was that the phenomenon did not repeat cleanly but instead dispersed, appearing in fragments across time and space. There is no final report, no concluding theory. The case does not end. It stabilizes into a condition that institutions learn to live with and individuals encounter without preparation. The question that remains is not what was found, but what was avoided, not what should not exist, but what exists beyond the frameworks we rely on to define reality. And now, as you listen to this, as this account reaches you at a specific moment in a specific place, it becomes part of that pattern, another data point, another quiet arrival. If you want to continue following investigations like this one, where sealed records, suppressed findings, and unresolved patterns are examined carefully and without sensationalism, consider subscribing. These stories do not resolve cleanly, but they persist, and bearing witness to them is sometimes the only record that remains.